last year in 2018, not to mention all the floods.
Hello everybody, like Tamara said, I worked as a journalist in and around this area for the last 20 years or so, and up until recently that's what I was doing, and now I am in the political realm. So I switched jobs partly through the project. Actually in this video I think you'll kind of see both aspects of what I've been doing as I got involved with this project. And so the first part is more the journalistic part of it, kind of documenting what the damage was and just what's going on in the watersheds, and then the other part of it is more about, this is where we are, where can we go moving into the future. We've got some journalists here tonight. Jillian's here. I don't know, is there any other journalists? Okay. Well, when you work in a rural area as a journalist, you get a front row seat to all kinds of stuff, and good, bad, otherwise. I think every once in a while you have these stories that have a much bigger arc to them, much longer timeline. And as I started to deal with this, like I said, I was doing this for 20 years. The first disaster I covered, I think, was Viola's tornado in 2005. I was there 5 minutes after the tornado hit, and people were coming out of their basements. And with the flooding, I was going to flooding recovery meetings in the last year, and it kind of struck me that this is a bigger story. This has got a bigger timeline, a bigger arc. There's things that are going on in the watershed, and this story needs to get out there. And I can give you maybe the little seed that I had, maybe a part in how this started. I had Lisa out. We'd been together not too long, and we weren't married yet. And she knew that I was a journalist, and we had known each other quite a while. But I don't think she really realized what I did. So I said, well, I got to go cover this flood. And you want to go with? Sure. So we drove down. We were driving up and down Kickapoo trying to get photos and talk to people. And as the river does with a lot of these communities, it cuts a lot of these towns in half when it floods, and Viola in particular. And you cannot get from one side of Viola to the other when there's high water. So we got to Viola, and the water had gone down a fair amount, but it wasn't all the way down. So I said, well, I got to get to Village Hall, and it's over there. So we got to go through this water. So the time we got home, we were mud, and we were a mess. But that is typical of journalists and other. You get home and you're full of dirt and mud, and you get to shower and clean yourself up, and then you think about the people that are out there in the communities that have to live through that every day, and it really hits you. And so or some of you, I'll tell you that there's a lot of depiction of destruction in the front, so if that re-traumatizes some of you, it kind of did for me, because I was going back through my own photos going, wow, I didn't remember that. So that's the first part of it. The second part of it is a little more hopeful, so it's not all doom and gloom. So let's see if I can figure out how to. Okay. And I didn't include quite as much of the technical parts of the watershed things, all about the dams. This is more, tonight's more about the stories from the people that live here.
There are 7 seats up here, though. Folks in the back, if you want to move up, you get bonus points. Yeah, be like church. Raise your hand if you have an empty seat next to you. Then you get extra.
The Driftless region. Home to unmatched beauty and unique geography. Home to dairy farms, small towns, and a mixture of people that are as unique as the landscape. It has been said that water is life. In this area, that is particularly true. The water in this area not only provides sustenance for agriculture, but also for the people through recreation and a way of life that is shaped by the water in these watersheds. Until recently, the people in this area have coexisted with those streams, but now they are at odds. Those who live here can tell you that something has changed. It is true that precipitation events have increased in intensity and frequency, causing those who live in these watersheds to constantly look over their shoulder. The people here have always known that Mother Nature has a mind of her own, but now people and communities barely get a chance to catch their breath when Mother Nature decides she will once again have her way on this landscape. As devastating as that flood was at the end of August in 2018, for those living in the Kickapoo River and Coon Creek watersheds, it was not the first time they had to deal with flooding and natural disaster. And although it would be too much to say they have become used to the flooding, if you talk to almost anyone living in these areas, they have begun to expect this new normal, the constant cycle of devastation, cleanup, recovery, moving on, and now bracing for the next event that almost everyone says they know is sure to happen again. While other parts of the country make bigger headlines, almost nowhere else has there been the constant level of devastation every year, certainly every couple of years. And although the people in this area are strong and pride themselves on resiliency, many of the individuals and communities living here are beginning to tire. If you talk to different experts in the area, they will tell you there has been anywhere from 7 major flood events to 10 or more minor flood events in just the last 10 years. That is forcing individuals and communities to come together to try to discuss how to prevent these disasters from happening, what has changed in these watersheds, and what can be done about it. Some have even suggested we begin to look to the past for answers about how to move forward into the future. There was a previous crisis that plagued these watersheds in the 1920s and the 1930s. Farming practices implemented throughout much of the country by immigrants that tilled soil that should probably never have been tilled touched off an ecological disaster that reached literally all the way to Washington. A man had been working inside of the federal government for years, advocating for farming practices and conservation practices that would take better care of the land. When a cloud from the Great Plains reached all the way to Washington, at the exact time that Hugh Hammond Bennett was testifying before Congress, asking for funding for implementing these new practices, Congress finally relented, funded Bennett's new agency, known at the time as the Soil Erosion Service, and would eventually become the Natural Resources Conservation Service. Bennett became friends with Wisconsin native and conservation legend Aldo Leopold. Together, they developed a pilot project right here in the Coon Creek, the nation's very first watershed project that pioneered many of the conservation practices that would be used throughout the country, practices that some would say even saved our nation. If you stand in Coon Valley's Village Park, you can see pillars that were constructed by the Civilian Conservation Corps, or the CCC. Those pillars are not far from where that CCC camp was located. About 300 men would travel out each day on the dusty roads with their picks and shovels, undertake conservation projects that would transform the Coon Creek watershed and the country. The irony is not lost on many local residents that those very pillars erected by the CCC have been inundated with floodwaters repeatedly over the last 10 to 15 years. It is perhaps the best sign that we have that we should once again look to the past to help find our way forward. Many area communities coming together now, asking what can be done to alleviate or prevent the constant cycle of devastation and recovery. Those at the Driftless Riding Center set out to collect stories from those living in these watersheds, not only to help heal and recover, but to try to make some sense of how to move forward and to once again live in harmony with the streams and rivers of the Driftless. Many of those stories collected throughout this project have been about hope, recovery, gratitude for living in a place where help oftentimes just comes without even asking.
video. That was fantastic, wasn't it? I want to talk a little bit about flood history and more on some of the history of the oral history projects here in the Kickapoo Valley. And the history of flooding in the Kickapoo Valley, goes back 125 years. And it's a lot to talk about. And after the flood of August of 2018, I wrote a number of articles for the Lafarge Episcopal newspaper, and I have kind of condensed those into a written paper here. So I'll put these out on the front desk if you'd like to get a copy. You can, but they're basically what I've already written and published on the history of flooding here in the valley. But one of the things I wanted to kind of talk about was, if you go back to the beginning of the flooding in regards to how it affected people, you go back to the 1890s. And it's kind of interesting that one of the first great floods was in 1899. And as a matter of fact, it was the highest flood that was ever registered up to that time in Ontario and at the mill in Rockton. And there had been several floods prior to that registered at those places, but this was a foot higher than anything they'd ever had before. And what I found interesting when you look at that 1899 flood is that the communities of the Kickapoo Valley, which were built along the river, mainly because they were all milling communities, and the mills were on the river, and you got as close to the mill as you could, and all of that kind of thing, or as close to the river as you could, and as close to the mill as you could. But two communities in particular, after that flood, reacted to it by moving away from it. And that was Seelyburg, just to our south here, on the other side of the hill from where we're at now, which was kind of like the original Lafarge. And that flood just devastated that community. There's fantastic photos in regards to that. And they basically, the businesses, the homes, the people just moved out of there and headed to higher ground in what we now know is Lafarge. And the other community was Reedstown. Reedstown, which was centered on the river, over more toward where Reeds Creek comes into the community there, just said, hey, this is stuff we don't want to deal with anymore, and made a conscious effort to kind of relocate their town center away from the river. We have that lovely square there now, and the business district that was created around that. That was a conscious decision to go to higher ground. And so as we're thinking about what we do in 2019, we can go back 90 years, and or 100 years, 110 years, and take a look at that and see that those communities had to react even at that particular time. I do want to talk about some of the oral history projects that have been done here in the Kickapoo Valley. And when I was thinking about this, I kind of went back to the bicentennial of 1976. And the country as a whole really was looking at preserving stories during that event. And here in the Kickapoo Valley, and all over the country really, but there was some real conscious efforts in several communities in the Kickapoo Valley here, including Lafarge, which was to go and talk to the older generation and get their stories, and get them recorded, and get them archived, and get them saved. And in Lafarge, in particular, there was a man named Dale Muller, who worked with other people, but then after the project kind of shut down, he kept at it. And he kept interviewing people and getting stories, and he'd spent his whole life listening to people telling stories. So he loved it. But those stories are in the archives in the museum at UW-Madison now, at the Historical Society, and you can go and listen to those, and they're intriguing. And we wouldn't have gotten those. Some kind of bug there. I hope it's not attractive balding heads. But, you know, and they were real effort to save that. And shortly after the bicentennial, another project was started called the Kickapoo History Project. And that was a federally funded, Kickapoo Valley Association sponsored attempt again to save stories in the late 1970s. And one of the things that came out of that was they wanted to share those stories with people. And so they started to, after they had some stories, they started to come out with a newspaper, really, all about history, which was called the Kickapoo Pearls. And they were going to do it quarterly, and they did the first one and sold out immediately, and ordered a reprint and sold out again and ordered another reprint, and they couldn't make them fast enough. And 3 months later, they said, okay, we're going to double our order and make twice as many as we did before, and sold out again. And what was so intriguing was everybody was interested in those stories. Whether it was a family from up in Wilton who was telling us a story, or somebody here in Lafarge or downriver in Keys Mills or Steuben who was telling these stories, and they were fascinating. And again, they were kept, they were saved, and when the project was concluded in 1979, they had put out 4 of the Kickapoo Pearls, and they actually took 2 more and then included them in this kind of a book format that includes all of those stories. But just invaluable stories, again, from people that were telling things to a younger generation about what it was like. And flooding is included in here. There's lots of stories about flooding, and interesting accounts from a man in Lafarge whose family worked for the railroad, and how the floods affected the railroad that was in the Kickapoo Valley until the late 1930s. So after that, and that kind of ties in with where we're at right now, in 2000, as the reserve was being created, one of the things that came up was the stories from the people who used to live here, that their homes and farms were bought up for the dam project, needed to be saved. And it was a time in which some of those people were starting to pass. And so there was a real effort, and Marcy West got it going, and the reserve and the school districts at Brookwood and Lafarge, and volunteers came forward, and we got students that went out, students from Lafarge High School went out with adult volunteers, and they just started interviewing people about their experiences regarding the dam project. And I will tell you that a lot of people didn't want to talk to them. They were still mad, they were bitter, they had bad feelings about the project, and they didn't want to get into that again. And we kept coaxing and talking, and the students came back. I remember the students came back after that first weekend of interviews, and they were just blown away with the emotion that came out from those interviews. And I think that's one of the things that Tim and I have seen on some of the interviews, or almost all the interviews, is the level of emotion that comes out in regards to this flood. But then that's important, and it's kind of interesting that at the end of that oral history project that we did, which eventually ended up having some of those interviews published in this book that people remember, which really compilations of articles that Bonnie Sterling did for the Viroqua newspaper after these interviews came out. But before she did that, after we did the initial set of interviews, we had the students at Lafarge that had done the interviewing, and some others who were good forensics and dramatic students, do an oral presentation about using the words that were in these interviews, and they presented them. And it was interesting that we gave the public presentation down at the community temple in Lafarge, and it was just jam-packed with the former landowners. Many who had done the interviews, but another large number of people who didn't do the interviews. And so these students came out and they did this presentation, which which had been developed by Stuart Stotts, but the kids sold it, and it was just an amazing response. And those of you, some of you were there that night, you know, it was just unbelievable response. And before the end of the night, some of those former landowners were coming up to me and say, put my name down, I want to be interviewed. I want my voices to be heard. And I think that's important to remember, that oral histories are good when you tell people your words are going to make a difference. Your words are going to be meaningful to other people. So here we are on another oral history project, and it's been going really interesting, and we were just, Carly and I were emailing back and forth, setting up more interviews for the weekend, and we got these great students from Madison that keep wanting to come up and talk to people. And I was telling Earl Nelson earlier, I said I just love this little booklet that was put together here, and then I saw he's in it all the time, so I'm not so sure about it. Sing. But I just, and that's what this is really all about, is hearing the stories and then sharing them with other people, and like Tim said, looking toward the future as to what we're going to do, but everybody who can have an understanding of what it's all about. So the project continues, and I want to encourage everybody, if you have a story, if you know people who have a story, contact us and we'll get out there and turn the tape recorder on. I even learned how to do that. So thank you very much.
Because I write, and that keeps me coherent, and mostly, sort of. And also, I want to be accountable to all of the stories that I've heard, and so I want to get them right. So I can be much more informal after this, but I have this prepared. I'll keep this closer to my mouth, or I'll try to. So, good evening, everyone. I'm really happy to see all of you here tonight. As Tamara said, my name is Caroline Gottschalk-Druschke. I'm an associate professor at the University of Wisconsin-Madison, and I am honored and humbled, frankly, to be speaking here tonight and to be involved with the Stories from the Flood project in the first place. I'm really grateful to Tamara, to the entire Stories from the Flood crew for the richness this project has brought to my life and work. I like to think of myself as an adopted child of the Kickapoo, or I hope to be. I'm from the Midwest originally. My parents are here tonight, which I'm thrilled about. Hello. But I only moved to Madison in fall 2017, at which point I promptly found every excuse I could to leave Madison and head here every chance I get. I've been the recipient of incredible warmth and kindness from Tamara Dean, Marcy and Dave West, Paul and Bernadette Hayes. Bernadette was my high school biology teacher, and it's amazing to see her here tonight. Chuck and Loretta Butcher, Brad Steinmetz, Matt Albright, Dave Creer, Shelley Brenneman, Tom Lukin, so many people who are here in the room. I'm so grateful. I've been teaching and researching in coordination with the Driftless Writing Center, with the Kickapoo Valley Reserve and Valley Stewardship Network, and I've spent most days from May to September, indeed, in Billings Creek and Warner Creek, waist deep through even some of this summer's flooding. To back up a bit, 11 months ago, Tamara reached out to me in the context of applying for the Wisconsin Humanities Council grant that eventually helped inaugurate this project. At the time, Tamara explained to me that she and her colleagues at the Driftless Writing Center were initiating an ambitious project. That's what your email said. I look back at it. To collect and share stories about the flooding in our area. They plan to collaborate, as you've heard, with Vernon County Libraries, rural sociology experts, local journalists, and historical societies to put a voice and face to catastrophic flooding in the region, and hoped to help flood-affected residents of the Kickapoo and Coon Creek watersheds process their trauma, while creating a historical record that might inform future planning and support community healing. The funding application for the Wisconsin Humanities Council required a faculty advisor, quote unquote, which is, I'm not, you are. I was happy to pledge my support. If ever a project linked my undergraduate degree in social work, a PhD in English and rhetoric, and my ongoing work in watershed ecology, it was absolutely this project. So I want to join the chorus of praise for the Wisconsin Humanities Council to be the first to support the initiative, to to the UW-Madison Morgridge Center for Public Service and the Holt Center for Science and Technology Studies, and to the incredible undergraduate students, who are going to make me cry, at UW-Madison, who I've worked with this semester. They have bravely launched into this collaboration with Stories from the Flood, interviewing community members, listening to every single story. So they know these stories. You know them firsthand, but you've only known your own, or maybe your neighbors. They have listened to all of them and are familiar with them. So I want to acknowledge them. If you can stand up for a second. Marissa Beatty is here. They'd like to join me in thanking you for letting us engage with and learn from your experiences. Whatever I'm feeling down about the future, I remember this group of young people making 4-hour round trips. They never complain. This is how they spend their weekends all semester. It's totally mind-blowing. I can email them at midnight on a Saturday, and someone on Sunday morning drives out to Lafarge happily with a recorder in hand, and I'm just blown away by that. So Tamara invited me to speak tonight and asked me to focus on how rivers and watersheds are changing and what that might mean for valley communities. I will do my best to do that. But I want to say at the outset that you are the experts, not me. You lived through the August 2018 floods, and for so many of you, so many of the memorable floods that preceded it, 2008, 2007, 1978, add the years, all over. An octogenarian friend of mine who was born and raised in Valley, Wisconsin, close by, told me recently that the flood of 1935 was his very first memory of his life. As water filled his family's farm fields and rushed towards and eventually into their farmhouse. These floods mark time in the region, and everything that I've heard from the remarkable oral histories that make up the existing Stories from the Flood archive, time is speeding up. When Stories from the Flood storyteller Clinton Bagstad from Westby was asked how this flood compares to previous ones, his answer was simply, it doesn't. We had floods before, he explained, but nothing like this. Another storyteller, Earl Nelson, who I guess is here. It's crazy to see you. Oh my God. So please, I want to say hi to you after. That's amazing. And my students will too. Earl Nelson wondered, I don't know, but it don't take near the rain anymore to get the Kickapoo River out of its banks. Ron Campbell from Ontario. Is Ron here? Just like shout out if you're here. Questioned, 2017 was a record flood. It matched the record. In 2018, it was above the record. So you tell me they don't think it'll ever get that high again? I mean, it's like, really? Celie Wolf from Soldiers Grove. Put it simply, I mean, it's gotten more severe, she said, year by year. This hunch that what we experienced in August 2018 is part of a new normal seems appropriate. The Kickapoo River and Coon Creek watersheds, as we've been hearing, have experienced 5 at least 100-year magnitude floods in the last decade. Climate forecasts predict this pattern to intensify. The August 2018 flood caused an estimated $29 million in damage, almost $1,000 per person, by my math, to businesses, homes, and public infrastructure in Vernon County alone. The Wisconsin Initiative on Climate Change Impacts, known as WICI, a collaboration between UW-Madison's Nelson Institute for Environmental Studies and the Wisconsin Department of Natural Resources, offered a comprehensive report in 2011 entitled Wisconsin's Changing Climate, Impacts and Adaptations. That report states in no uncertain terms that climate models predict instances of heavy rainfall to increase in frequency in southern and western Wisconsin, alongside increasing temperatures across seasons. Those changes matter, of course, for flooding. As the Wiki report explains, quote, expected increases in the magnitude and frequency of large rainfall events will very likely increase flood magnitudes in all Wisconsin streams and rivers. The increase is likely to be greatest in watersheds that are most vulnerable to flooding in late winter or early spring, when the likelihood of increased rainfall resulting from climate change is the greatest. Places, in other words, like here, like Kickapoo and Coon Creek. We should expect increases in spring runoff into the future and longer periods of flooding, even into the fall, as we've seen, thanks to rapid snowmelt, flashy rainstorms, saturated soils. No, we won't see those impacts every single year, though that's hard to imagine, I feel like, right now. But these are trends that are expected to continue and worsen. In other words, our collective sense The sense I've heard from folks I've talked with throughout the valley, and the sense offered in interview after interview in the Stories from the Flood archive, that something isn't quite right, seems apt. The effects of chronic and catastrophic flooding are widespread, as the folks gathered here know better than anyone. Floods negatively impact agriculture, forcing replanting costs, loss of soil productivity, increases in soil erosion, infrastructural challenges to milk processing, challenges for cattle grazing. Floods damage homes, businesses, and rural infrastructure. From the catastrophic damages we saw in 2018 to the road closures, leaky basements, rescheduling of popular events, and interruption of stream restoration projects and other infrastructure projects this past summer. Floods also pose serious human health risks that are both immediate and long-lasting. It is unbelievable to me that no one died in the August 2018 floods, as far as I'm aware. All the more unbelievable after listening to the incredible dangers that so many of you faced. Storyteller Cheryl Mickelson from Gaze Mills describes slamming into a wall of floodwater in the dark on Highway 131 driving to work in last year's flood. She was stuck sitting in her stalled out car, cold floodwater rising to waist level past her seats before help finally arrived. So many of you described watching or hearing the Erie Park hill slopes give way into the road in front of you, or the road itself giving way. Monica Sanchez and her children in Wilton recalled that the floodwater covered their air conditioner and the steps up to their home as they tried to leave. They and so many people who shared their stories emphasized just how fast the water was moving. There was no way to step into it. Aaron Appleman from Lafarge described the harrowing moments when the town board realized they needed to cut power to the town. When Appleman questioned how that was going to happen, he described Brett Franks telling him, "Okay, I have to get out of the boat and I'm going to stand in chest-high water and pull the plug." Really? Appleman questioned. There's no other way to do this? Brett just looked at me, he recalled. He goes, I hope I really see you in about 15 minutes. I'm like, yeah, I really hope I see you too. Brian McGuire, volunteer first responder in Coon Creek, shared story after story of close calls. That night, stories that, as he said, sent a shiver down our spines. But as many of you have seen, the health risks of flooding remain long after floodwaters recede. Flooding can spread harmful bacteria and viruses, as the Wiki report explains, and it sounds like there have been some mixed messages circulating about how to safely clean up mold in the wake of a flood. Laura and Andy Patton, owners of the county seat laundromat in Viroqua, described soaking tubs of cleaning solutions spread around the block in front of their store to deal with the influx of people needing to wash the only clothes they had left. So many of you experienced intestinal and respiratory illnesses in the weeks and months following the flood, and many of those extend from people's selfless volunteering for cleanup efforts. Brad Otto from Gaze Mills pointed to all of the generous help he received from neighbors and strangers in the wake of the flood, but described the impossible working conditions for so many of you during the cleanup. As a group helped Otto haul wet insulation out of the crawl space of his home, he reflected, that was just a thankless, hideous job. And you were standing in our crawl space in like at least a foot of water while we were doing that, so the insulation would fall down and splash everybody, and it's like mud water with cow poop and Monsanto in it. Julie Frazier from Lafarge was spurred to open the donation center that helped so many people across the region, in part, as she described, because we went and helped people clean up, she said, a lot of the mud and stuff out of some of their rooms, because that flood mud was just stinky. It was really nasty stuff, and we heard of people getting sick and things like that. Many of you experienced months of illness, like Ron Campbell in Ontario, who blamed the persistent mold for having such a bad cough for months that, as he explained, I couldn't go anywhere. I stopped going out in public because I couldn't stop coughing. Beverly Bagstad from Westby got sick every time she returned to their flood-damaged home. A combination, she thought, of the house or just being there, a combination of mental and mold. These health effects, of course, are both physical and psychological. The impacts of persistent catastrophic flooding cannot be underestimated, and there's clearly a need for more mental health resources for folks in the valley, and thanks to those who are doing that already. Storyteller after storyteller explained, like Monica Sanchez, I don't feel safe. As Brad Otto shared, the rain just wouldn't stop, and when it gets like that, you get a sick feeling. It It goes on for a long time. First responder Brian McGuire described the lasting impacts of the many rescues he participated in, saying, "I can go right back to that night. I'm there. I'm walking down the street and the water's up to my chest, and you almost get like a shiver in your back. And, you know, it doesn't scare me. It's just, I'm there." Even though she's since been forced to move up and away from the river since the flood, Claudia Dull, is Claudia here? Hi. Hello. Explained, "I noticed water in the street. I actually get like, oh no, this isn't going to happen again. And I'm high and dry, but I'm still afraid." Celie Wolf, director of the Soldiers Grove Public Library, who might also be here, explained, "These things mark a person, trauma like that." Judy Mixter of Coon Valley said, "I still have anxiety when it rains out or when there's thunder and lightning." Gwen Severhughes from Westby explained, "Usually if it rains more than an hour and a half, I get in the car and leave." Celie Wolf described the collective effect of that persistent fear. "I can see a subdued attitude, habitually, where I didn't see that before. Like someone who's been, you know, basically a joyful, optimistic, friendly, happy person is struggling still a year later." So I want to take a moment to honor those stories and all of those I haven't heard. They are significant, they matter, and they will help us envision a better future. The people of these valleys, you folks, have done this before, as we heard. We have similar themes here. When catastrophic soil erosion threatened waterways and livelihoods in the 20s and 30s, the Coon Creek watershed hosted the nation's first large-scale demonstration project for what was then the Soil Erosion Service, and became an example, as we saw in the film, for the nation. Only 2 years after its inception in 1935, half of the watershed, over 400 farms and over 40,000 acres, had signed conservation agreements. Farmers and conservation workers had strip cropped nearly 13,000 acres, were managing 12,000 acres of woodlands, and improvements continued. Soil losses in the watershed dropped by almost 10 tons per acre per year over the 40-year period from 1934 to 1975. And through the 50s and 60s, the area was noticing a decrease in flooding. Writing about Coon Creek's legacy in a 50-year anniversary tribute, author Douglas Sorensen in the Journal of Soil and Water Conservation concluded by emphasizing what can be accomplished when dedicated professional people team up with a community to solve a problem. I can't help but feel we're in a similar moment again. I'm sure others are feeling that way as well. And I hope that the group gathered in this room is an indication of the power of community members with the support of a dedicated group of professionals to solve or at least productively address this problem together. I'm thrilled to be here to honor all those people who came forward to share their stories and to see that we have people, decision makers in the room, news media, historians, university researchers, and students here to listen to those stories and find ways to support community members in your work to live together with this new normal. I can imagine folks might not feel like there's a lot to celebrate right now, that you're not feeling especially resilient. As Ron Campbell offered, I think people are struggling and waiting for something to do, something to change. But there's a huge amount of power in coming together to share these stories. In thinking together about what the people of the Kickapoo and Coon Creek watersheds need and how other people, university folks, policymakers, legislators in the room tonight, can step up to help support those needs. The people of the Kickapoo and Coon Creek watersheds aren't necessarily asking for help, but to the decision makers gathered here, I am asking for help on their behalf. There is a significant need for flood recovery assistance, both financial and emotional. There's a need for coordinated planning and better access to recovery resources. People are still dealing with the impacts of the August 2018 flood, knowing that the next one is on the horizon. But I know too that the people of these watersheds, you people, are resilient to your core. Former project recovery worker John Gilbranson noted his surprise in working with flood-affected folks in the wake of the floods about the resiliency of people. This is a moment to draw on that deep well of strength, sense of place, and community connection, and look to the future. The Stories from the Flood archive is filled with expressions of pragmatism, courage, and gratitude. As Terry Robinson from Wilton put it, we'll survive, I'm just not sure how. My students and I have been continually shocked by the power, honesty, and bravery of these flood stories. Storyteller after storyteller downplayed their own losses, claiming, like Monica Sanchez, Claudia Dull, and many others, that neighbors had it worse, putting others' needs above their own. People found solace in the stunning generosity of neighbors and strangers. As Brad Niemczek in Gays Mills put it, the most amazing thing was the amount of people that showed up and said, "What can I do to help?" Kyle Martz in Gays Mills expressed, "Nothing connects people like going through the same painful thing." Brad Otto explained, "Really, the only thing that saved me is that I have a community in a way I never expected." Those community connections will be a source of strength as we move forward. As Celie Wolf reflected, I think looking ahead that we just really need to be ready to meet the future fearlessly, which is hard. But you know, if we're going to survive this and move ahead, we have to be ready, she said, because the flooding is not going to go away. I want to close tonight by noting some of the things I think we need to do to be ready. We need projects like this one that document and call attention to the stories of those impacted by flooding. We need the universities in the state to continue to support research and teaching initiatives that draw from community experiences and expertise to move forward with floods. We need state funding to do the same. We need to improve infrastructure with this new normal in mind, replacing roads, bridges, culverts with designs that accommodate this future of flooding. We need improved flood modeling and updated floodplain mapping. We need better information about how flood-affected residents can access recovery funds and stay safe and healthy during floods and after them. We need more mental health resources for folks suffering from the long-term devastation of repeated flooding. And we need to continue to live in awe and wonder of our region's waterways, remembering the lessons of these early conservationists and doing our collective best to slow water running off the landscape, to reconnect our waterways to their natural floodplains, to support land management practices to address accelerated soil erosion, to connect with each other like we're doing right now, and to live well together into the future. Thanks.
I can kind of add to that, I'm in a unique position, like I said. I started out this project as a journalist trying to document what's going on and explain to other people what's going on. Now I'm in a position where I have to try and figure out, since I work for a local politician, how to try and help the situation and fix it. And Carrie's sitting back there smiling because when I came on board, she went, "Aha, I used to explain problems to her. Now I'm the one that's got to go, okay, how do we do this?" I can tell you, just to give a little bit of maybe light at the end of the tunnel, there are people that are having these discussions and trying to work on these exact things that you talked about. Ben's here in the room, Ben's County Conservation is here in Boone County, teamed up with 2 other counties. They're trying to get money for long-term watersheds, and I think that's the first step. I've been to a lot of flood recovery meetings, some of them in this room over the last year, and a lot of those discussions have centered around what occurred to me, drive home from them, and I thought, step number 1 is we have to figure out what's going on. Because really, I saw a lot of communities trying to make decisions kind of like in the dark. Like, we're not even sure what the problem is, first of all, and I think Ben's going a good step forward in trying to figure out what's going on in the watersheds, and then we can try and figure out what to do about it. And so we got that long-term track, but also we are working on the short-term things. And so the other thing I thought about driving home from those meetings was we have to do, I think, 1 of 2 things. We have to either move people out of the way, or we have to build that infrastructure, like you said, to handle this new normal. Gives people some reassurance that even if it does flood like this, it can handle this new normal, because right now everybody's just nervous, and like the stories say, you hear it rain and you're just waiting for the next one. So.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's really important. I realize that sometimes we do focus on loss, and it's hard not to because it's been a heartbreaking time, but it's also great to look toward the future and talk about solutions, and particularly how communities can work together, not just in isolation, to find those solutions. So, any questions about any part of this? Yes, please.
Given the anti-science climate emanating out of Washington and even out of Madison, how how can anything change? If everybody says, well, I can't believe the scientists. Well, the scientists are the ones we think that can help us come up with some of the solutions. What do you think? I mean, is it?
Caroline can
Yeah.
Really, Caroline just got tenure, she's gonna get fired. What do you really think? I don't know that I have a great, I like that you backed away. I could think of a few different answers. One of my immediate answers is that I try to be a very pragmatic, solutions-oriented person. And in some of my previous work that I was doing living in New England, in between being in the Midwest and then out in New England, some of that work was actually with fishermen who were dealing with impacts of climate change, but many of them didn't believe in climate change. And a lot of my colleagues would say, well, what do you do to convince them? And I said, I actually don't really care if they believe in climate change. I want to know what they're seeing, what they're experiencing, how they're responding, how can they respond better, how can they be more resilient in their lives and communities. And so that's a little bit of an evasive answer, but it is actually a straightforward answer, is that I don't necessarily need to change someone's entire worldview in politics, but I do want to sort of bring them together to think about how to move forward, what we're seeing differently. I do, at the same time, think that these institutional structures are incredibly challenging, and I know that I showed up in a moment in the state of Wisconsin where things are opening a little bit to, again, having those conversations. I know from colleagues at the DNR who will remain nameless, this is an easier moment for them than it was 6 months ago, and they feel that very, very palpably, and that is helping them in a lot of ways, but we have lost a lot of time, certainly, and research and all kinds of good efforts that were happening. I mean, there's a reason that the wiki report that I cited is from 2011. The timing of that is, right? 2011, that's when it was updated, so they're back working on that again. But that's a real, it's a real damage and detriment to the problems that you all are facing, and I think, I don't mean to be evasive at all, but I think getting people together, thinking about what can happen, thinking about what people are seeing and what they can do together to move forward is sort of a good way to work in an even really challenging institutional context, I suppose. I don't know, you want to add?
Well,
Anyone
yeah,
else?
and everybody in this room, and anybody that's living in these watersheds can tell you it's going to happen again. So you can deny all you want, but come out here. And I think there's an economic argument too that I'd like to say we're not going to FEMA our way out of this. We're not. You keep spending money to recover. We need a different approach. So it just makes more sense economically to not have the damages versus.
Brad, would you like to add anything? Okay.
He's history, not future.
No, I mean, I don't
Does anyone else have a question? Yes, Kyle.
I was really fascinated by that footage that you came up with in your presentation. I'm wondering how much of that was intentional that you got and how much of it you ran across after you decided to do this. And I'm also wondering, how can we leverage drones in the future to get, pictures like that? Because it seems like during the height of a flood like that,
It was a little both.
how valuable could that be?
Yeah. Some of the footage was from Trevor Clark. He works for Richland Electric Cooperative. He's a licensed drone operator. And I contacted him while the flood was going on. He had posted a video that I saw, and it was really good. It was from Reedstown area. And I said, can you go do more of that? And so he did. So we've been in constant contact since then. And the other one I just came across on YouTube, and I got it with a guy, and I was able to use that footage. So it's a little both. But yeah, moving into the future, I mean, just completely changes your perspective. And it's very valuable.
Any other questions before we move on to sharing our stories?
Can I just make a comment? I've done disaster mental health work since 2001. And we were living in a small town of Siren, Wisconsin in June of 2001 that was hit by a tornado. And then in September, 9/11 hit. And once 9/11 hit, the money that flowed into disaster mental health was astronomical. And there was somebody at that point who said to me, mark my words, this money will dry up and you'll hit a point where you're going to have to reinvent it. And a year ago, I was called up by the state of Wisconsin to write the grant for Project Recovery, and all the institutional knowledge was gone down there. So there's two things I know about disasters. One is that they're local, and two is that they're political. And I would say the work you've done, the storytelling, is how you begin to move the political process. Because it's when you hear the stories, it goes from our heads to our hearts, and we realize that we have to do something. And politicians don't necessarily operate from here. But it's through the continual stories and the collective storytelling that's going on here locally that we begin to understand that change comes about by sharing these stories, just as you've done, and then involving the policymakers to hear the stories and get them to start operating their hearts. So I really commend you for the work you've done here on this project.
Thank you for your, like, this is Gil.
I should say that Gil was one of the people who helped train us as facilitators, and I am no counselor. And I really wondered if listening to people's stories was going to be helpful or if it was going to be more harmful, re-traumatizing. And so you were a fabulous asset and help to us in the beginning to this project. Yeah, thank you. Any other comments or questions? No? Well, I invite people to share stories, and I'd absolutely love to hand you the microphone if you have a story from the flood you want to share with the group. And if you have a story that you'd like to share individually, as I mentioned, you can contact Carly, who's standing in the back, or sign up on our sign-in sheet.
I would like to thank Caroline and her students for helping with this project. It was kind of amazing, as she was saying about how the students bought into this. And a couple of things I would like to relate to some of the interviews they did. And there was a pair that were here on Sunday who did an interview with Pastor Mark Phillips. And they were at the church. And you know how that goes, church goes long. And then there was a baptism, so it went longer. and they were patiently waiting in the back. And so anyway, they sat down with Mark, and it went on for a couple of hours. And I asked Mark afterwards, how was it? He said, it was a great experience. He said the level of interest those students had in these stories is just amazing. And then another thing was a few weeks ago, a couple of students interviewed Elmer and Angie McCauley down in Viola. And of course their house was devastated by the flood. And they originally said they didn't want to be interviewed. They had to go away from it for a while. And finally, as we were trying to set up some of these interviews, I said, would you be interested in doing it now? And a year later, they said, yeah, I think it'd be all right. So the interview was over, and the next day I saw them at church. And so I said, how did the interview go? And Elmer said, well, we didn't think we were going to cry, but we immediately did. And we started crying. They said, you know, the beauty of it was the students cried along with us. That's how they felt about it. And they were so touched by that those students were so into these stories, and would share that emotion with them. And like Elmer and Angie said, it ended up being a great experience for them. And thank you, students. You were just, I know some of you are here tonight, so thank you. Wonderful.
Yes. All right, excellent. Oh,
Tenzin focused on that, to that question.
I was just gonna say, this would be a great project for us students.
I just want to say first, it's amazing that, I covered one of your interviews, I recognized your voice, and it's so amazing to see you. So thank you so much for sharing the story then, and in terms of the interviews that I looked over, so I looked over around 9 of the individuals that were interviewed, of the 50, and from those interviews, I did capture that, like there was, people use a lot of social media, and used it as a way to, one, like in the beginning of it, right, update themselves on like, okay, is this actually going to be a substantial flood, and do I have to react to it? And that was like Quevedo Sanchez, I don't know if you're familiar with that family, but they used it to, like, that was one of the things that alerted them at first, was like they saw a little video at some point, and then she saw that when she was working, and then realized that she had to get home to her family and leave. And also when I was interviewing the coordinator of this the Valley Reserve.
Marcy West?
Marcy West, yes.
Marcy.
Yes, she was definitely talking about how communities after the flood, used Facebook as a way to communicate with each other and rally together to help each other out. So there's definitely that aspect of using communication, to build this resilience throughout the universe.
Yeah, and I could speak specifically to that because at the time I was starting to use Facebook as a journalist, and at that time it was under the Great Rivers News name, later Vernon Reporter, but I was tapping into it prior to the flood, and then when the flood hit, it just exploded. I had a video that was on the bridge at Viola that had 60,000 hits. The original post for road closures for Vernon County had 50,000 hits. So it became a tool, and I realized, wow, people really want this. So I tried to use that, and then there was a group that started in the Coon Valley area to use social media to get the word out. And I've asked some people at the county level. Vernon County was really good at getting information out, Crawford County not so much. You couldn't get road closures. So the counties are starting to figure it out. And it's really important. I had people calling me at 4 o'clock in the morning going, can I get to work in La Crosse? And I'm like,
And I love those really creative routes, so if you go on this hollow.
can I get through on double S? And it's on the list. But it is a really important tool because it can, and I really focused on what authorities are putting out because it's literally life and death. We've had people drive into waters and drown, so if the law enforcement says it's not open, it's not open. Don't go there. No.
I've gotten text messages sometimes of like tornadoes or something, but are there for floods as well?
Yes. Yeah. Yeah. And Marcy can maybe speak to this because she's, they have to alert people if there are people camping in the area and those kind of things. So they do have, Ben can maybe talk about it too, they do have.
Nixle would be something everyone should sign up for.
They do have,
NIXEL, and that the emergency management will push out warnings through that system.
And we don't have Nixle.
Vernon County, yeah.
Vernon County has a crowd.
But you can sign up for it in zip codes around you and still get the text.
Really, so you
Yeah.
could sign up by zip code?
Yes, you sign up by zip code, and so you would get them. I sign up for Ontario, obviously, so I know what's coming at me, and then I sign up for Lafarge and Richland Center as well, La Crosse. You can sign up for other zip codes. But kind of for a plug for the future, one of the things that has come out from this is U.S. Geologic Survey has the gauges on the rivers.
Yes.
and National Weather Service. We got all of those people together because we really need to know what's coming out of the Cashton side, Norwalk, Wilton, for how
Yes.
fast things are coming, the flash kind of style. And so those have improved, the conversations have improved, and I think there's another UW project with students working in Monroe County that may evolve to a citizens where you get a weather station, and now we have a weather station that the National Weather Service can just go to a centralized site and see what amount of rain and how fast the rain is coming, so that they improve their prediction service. Because when you talk to them, and all of us know, we thought we were gonna get 2 or 3 inches that night, and, you know, we got 13 to 15, that then they have a better idea as well of how fast it's coming down and when the impacts start. So that's one of the things that's coming out. It's slow moving, and gosh, I hope our elected officials up in Washington support it.
Yeah, somebody should talk to me.
National Weather Service. Welcome, Greg.
Yeah, we have a representative all the office here too, so. I wanted to just say something to what Kathy was talking about. Kathy, that was a common thing you heard, and any of the journalists in here can tell you when you go out with your stories, the most common thing you hear around here is, well, I don't really have a story. It's been, yeah, I kind of got hit, but boy, the Johnsons, they're really hit. They really got hit hard. You should go talk to them. But everybody's story is important. And sometimes when people start telling it, they don't realize how important it is and how important it is for them to talk about it. And so if you know people, and I think sometimes people think it's got to be like the firemen on the fires that, you know, went out and saved people from drowning, but it can be anybody. You know, like Kathy's story. It's, you know, so encourage people to come and talk to us and tell their story. It's very important. So, anybody else?
I have a
You got a question in the back, and we'll get. Go ahead.
I wonder if we could turn the microphone around and ask one or more of the UW students to recount why they took part in this and how it changed them.
Okay. Good question. Students, who wants to talk? This guy looks like he wants to talk. He's not talking.
Okay, hi, so I'm Marissa. I actually signed up for a different summer and was put in this one on accident. Yes, but everyone in the class is so amazing, and everyone in the communities has been so amazing. And Caroline's been so amazing that I stayed, and I'm really happy I did. I've never experienced flooding in my entire life. I'm from outside Milwaukee, and I live on a huge hill. And so the most flooding I've ever heard about is my neighbor's alpaca farm that gets like 2 feet in their basement. And so this was just a really shocking experience, and the fact that all of you and every story you've heard has largely been positive, no matter how much you've lost. And that's been just really incredible, and I'm actually continuing this project next semester because I have become so invested in this and cared so much about this, and so it's been honestly life-changing for me, so I thank all of you for allowing us to be a part of this.
Did you have a story? No, I don't have a story. My husband and I weren't affected by the flood, but I keep hearing people say how frustrated they are in their dealings with the bureaucracy, like Kathy's story. But I keep hearing this over and over, and I know that there was some work earlier to help people start the process, but now people are way into it and they're getting nebulous or no response. Is there any, how can people get help at this point if they're bogged down in the quagmire of bureaucracy?
Right, that's a great question, and I believe that the Project Recovery folks are the best people to help guide people through this?
And project recovery is ending next week.
Oh, it is? I thought they got extended.
Well, they're talking about some of that. But-
Okay.
So that's a year project.
Okay.
And I would say it continues by what we're doing here tonight. That we can't rely on government to come in and take care of this or provide services. We provide it for ourselves. And once we stop talking about it, people go back into the shadows and live with their suffering. And so the more that you keep this alive through conversation, the more people understand this is not a one-time event.
I want to answer or get some clues toward her more practical questions, because I think one of the great benefits to Project Recovery's interventions were that they helped people figure out what forms you need to fill out and what documentation you needed for those forms, and whether you had exclusions or stipulations that you had to abide by. Is there anyone stepping in still, even if Project Recovery goes away? Okay,
No,
you're not sure.
But I think that one of the things is linking people, because what you may not know in one neighborhood, someone might know in another. And that's where you start to continue to share information, and you can't do it alone.
Oh, yeah, Ben? Maybe it was my-
I'm a bit of the bureaucracy here, willing to accept some blame. Ben Moyan, Vernon County Conservationist. Would also at some point like to introduce Monique Hassman, our new watershed planner, who we tried for 3 years to create this position. It wasn't until the floods of 2018 that they actually would allow us to do it, and really it was because we had zero county levy money is why they probably agreed to it. I wish I had better solutions, or I wish I had better answers for people right now. We do have a long-term vision of what things need to happen. So pretty much every day I ask Monique to start working on something new, because we have so many things that need to be done. One is a simple mapping, just mapping of where the damage has occurred for so long. You know, all of our 07, 08, and every year since, it's on a piece of paper in a file cabinet. So how can you ever, look at the benefits to making improvements, whereas FEMA will say at best you can replace what was already there, but we all know better. We know we can't just keep doing the same thing over and over. Pretty much every day I get asked when we're fixing Jersey Valley, or why would we ever fix Jersey Valley? And all I can say is, the only thing I can promise is we will not do the exact same thing. But as Tim talked about, we're working hard, multi-county, and I'm looking at Gillian now, who helps remind us of the history of whole watershed planning. Shouldn't be based on county boundaries, but really does need to involve everybody. We need to document a lot, and this is a good example. I don't know why it's Vernon County that would have to figure out that FEMA's reporting is garbage. You need to be able to, so in our small little world, I think we just got our last check for a 2016 flood damage, at Sadie Hollow. And it would be 7 different FEMA people who each time you'd have to come and re-explain it. And it's kind of like, I'm sorry, I live on the ridge. I don't experience what a lot of you folks experience, but we hear about it every day, and we have a lot of empathy, and we know the need is there, and we know the need is nowhere near being met. If any of you have been blessed with the rare opportunity to work with Matt Albright as a technician, he's an amazing individual who's almost a pseudo-engineer. We need at least 5 of him in this county just to meet current demand, much less really future resilience. We try very, very hard to do outreach and education about farming practices, land management. we do have a lot of long-term vision, but it's slow. But I put a lot of hope in Monique, maybe unfairly.
The pressure is on.
Absolutely amazing individual who truly does care. And we do have good support from our politicians. They're listening, but it's hard. And locally, please continue to share with them what needs to happen. Please don't blame the people on the other end of the phone or behind your desk, which is hard though, because you folks are understandably going through so much. And we have a lot of ideas, and we are making a lot of progress, but we need the whole community, and I hope Monique will share something.
No pressure there. Well, welcome. I'm 3 weeks into a watershed planner position for Grand County. There is a lot on my plate. We all want a simple answer. We want one sentence fix for all of the problems that we're facing. However, watersheds, just like any problem, tends to be very multi-complex. There's always a history and politics involved, so we're negotiating all that every day. The game plan at this point is working on data collection, which we have, but then spatially mapping it out to understand where the problems have been. We all know that, that's local knowledge. Everyone in this room knows where the problems are, but if we don't have it on a map, it's not quote-unquote official. So part of this is working on making sure that we have this information documented and then disseminated into the right hands. That's going to take time. As Ben mentioned, this information right now is on paper in binders. And we're talking about dozens of binders and for over a decade collected. The money hasn't been allocated to do this work yet because they've been busy. Our GIS team who put out those maps of what roads have been open and closed have been working on a host of other projects, parcel mapping, which we're just completing with the mandate for the state of Wisconsin. So now we're just beginning the work that should have been done, but here we are, this is where we're at. And then once we have that information documented, then we can begin to look at some of the game plans of planning and how we're going to use a multi-pronged approach going forward. As Ben had mentioned, not doing the same thing. The rain events, all of the weather events that we're having these days are not what they were. And so we have to think in different, unique ways, think progressively. And I think it's very urgent that we begin this work as soon as possible. So we're hitting the ground running, and we're here to collect, hear these stories. This is important. This reminds us on when we get down and we get defunded or whatever it is, if we don't get a grant for the work that we're trying to do, this encourages us to go back to the office and go, okay, we gotta keep at this. These are the faces of the, that we have to look at. We live in this community with you. We want to see these changes be made as well. You're our neighbors. The other piece about this, I get a little emotional about it when I talk, is my research. I come from a social science background as a cultural anthropologist. And I've been documenting for the last 10 years stories of flood survivors in New Orleans, specifically Hurricane Katrina in the lower Ninth Ward. And so what's interesting is having this at the downstream, all the way down at the end of the Mississippi, and being, on the uplands of that, and then having these stories happen in my own backyard, and seeing the impacts that we can have, further downstream. I guess it is also intriguing that some of these floods have happened on the anniversary date of Hurricane Katrina, which really hits home for me as I was writing my dissertation. And that doesn't go away, but I'm not sure, I'm not sure how well. I'm really taken back by the night and the stories and the work that you're doing. Very encouraged. I look forward to hearing more. This is important work. I know it firsthand because I've documented it myself. When we talk about comparing stories to one another, those down in New Orleans, Hurricane Katrina, they lost not just personal possessions, not just their home, not just their neighbor's house, not just their block, but their whole community, corner stores, churches, businesses. So you had whole neighborhoods totally lost. We still have ridge tops with homes, we still have businesses, we still have churches, we still have a community. This community wasn't totally displaced. And I don't mean to try to compare, but I'm trying to connect dots. This is not just happening here, this is happening across the country. And if we look beyond this country, we're seeing this happen all over the world, these extreme weather events. And so documenting the stories is part of the process, and I'm encouraged that I can be part of that story process going forward, because it's one thing to document what happened in the past, but now I have an opportunity with this new position, which I'm so encouraged that Vernon County has, to be on the proactive side of planning and how do we look forward. And to be honest, I really need to be there, because this work is very intense, it is very emotional, it is very draining. And so I couldn't be more encouraged to now be on the front lines of the planning going forward. So thanks for the opportunity, Diane.
Really quick points, and then I'll give the microphone out. One is really to Tim and to Gillian, you folks reporting on this, you guys bringing so much attention. Tim, I wish you were in these rooms every day the way you used to be. I wish you were holding the county board and everyone accountable the way you used to. And really quick to Valley Stewardship Network, without them, without their care for water quality, without them partnering with us on so many things, Monique would never exist, and so many things that are going on would never exist. And then again, back to Gillian and the work with the farmer-led watershed groups and the watershed-based groups, that we really hope that model grows. I wish political boundaries were based on watersheds, because then people actually seem to care a little bit more, because guess what always runs downhill? It's not just floodwaters. So again, the watershed groups are local reporters and Valley Stewardship Network and my staff and crew. And I think as we've talked, we really need to make sure they all get interviewed and are part of this, because they've done a lot firsthand as well. So thank you for that.
Thank you.
I just have a question, because you brought up that, like, you're Vernon County. I live in Viola, which is sometimes it's Vernon, sometimes it's Richland, you know. And, you know, you're making a point, but in reality, are there counterparts in Richland? Are you all working together, or what's happening there?
We definitely, I'm pretty loud, there's no need for microphones. We do partner very closely. I wish county lines didn't exist. Resources are super limited, and in Richland County in particular, I think their land conservation has one vehicle that they're required to share with the highway department. And Bob McKeel in Monroe County is one of the greatest people I've ever met in my life, and he's just really makes things happen, but it takes such a powerful, proactive approach. You know, Crawford County is an important partner, La Crosse County, Richland County. Hopefully we can continue to work towards a watershed-based model where these kind of arbitrary political districts don't really dictate so many decisions.
And just to follow up on some of the things Monique was saying, and maybe under the guise of telling more flood stories, other people's flood stories. So there are two stories that really impacted me and changed my thinking on all this. One of them was in Lafarge. We had a flood recovery meeting. I remember a young man getting up toward the end of the meeting and saying, this really impacted me on what a difficult place a lot of residents are in. He said, 2008, the water was up to the floor joists in the house. Didn't get major damage, didn't get FEMA money. This last time around, it was in first floor. Got FEMA money, but he said, I've got a mortgage on my house, I've been living in a camper for 2 months, and I'm probably going to walk away. Because he says it's not going to replace, and I know it's going to come again in 2 years, so what's the point? So that gives you an idea of where some of these people are. You can't leave and you can't stay. Then there was another story. Governor Walker came and I think they had $5 million available. It was low or no interest loans for businesses. And I remember a business person, I think they were from Ontario, and they said, Governor Walker, I got a low interest loan last time. I don't need another low interest loan because I'm going to have a flood again. So that really struck me, both those stories, that people are in a really difficult spot. In communities like Gays Mills, they had 40 properties that they could either move or buy out. And communities like this are in a really difficult position because if you buy out those properties, which, okay, maybe that solves the problem for that property, but where do they go? If they don't build a home in that community, there goes their tax base. So the communities are in a difficult position as well. Ontario lost 19 to 24 businesses at some point. Some of them will come back. A lot of them don't even know if they'll be able to rebuild because they, can you trust the floodplain? Ontario Fire Hall was built, I think, a foot above the 100-year floodplain. They had 18 inches of water in the firehouse. So these towns and people are in this place where they can't move forward and they can't stay. So, so that's the kind of thing that we're trying to dig into. Yes, people are talking about, we're trying to find, there's that short-term track and there's a long-term track. So it's not easy, but somehow we got to figure out how to move ahead.
Thanks. Any other questions or comments? Yes, Paul.
Camera, I can speak loud enough, I think. I'm Paul Hayes, some of you know my wife Bernadette. We live on the west fork of the Kickapoo. We're about a quarter-mile downstream from where Knapp Valley joins the west fork, Highway P. And I have a little bit of a story of that night. I remember hearing some noise, unusual noise, 11 o'clock, 12 o'clock, middle of the night, it's hard to know. And from our porch with my strong flashlight beam, I looked down at our dry dam. And uh-oh, it's over the top. This is only the third time in 20 years that it's gone over the top of our dry dam. And it's just a little intermittent stream. Normally it's dry most of the summer. So, I went back to bed. Then an hour or two hours later, I hear something again. And I look out and it's not the dry dam. And I can't reach, my beam won't reach the west fork. We can see it in the daylight, but I couldn't see it at night. I said, uh-oh, there's something else going on here. I went back to bed, and then it happened again. And a bigger roar. And then I don't know which went first, the Jersey Valley Dam or the Millsna Dam, but they both went. And they came right down through in the back door of our pole shed and out the front door. Fortunately, our house is high and dry where we live now. Relating back to Brad's comments and Gil's comments about the emotional impact on people, I've become addicted to checking the radar in the middle of the night if it's raining. Some of us we're locked into that. Are we always afraid? I don't know. Young Ben visited us the other day, and he stirred up some of these memories, and not to criticize the process of opening old wounds, but it did. It forced me to reflect. The roaring, the cataract, still haunts me like a demon, in the words of Alfred Wallace. And I think many of us will feel that.
And I would say we all have anxiety management systems that we create for ourselves. I have one. I time my sump pump, and I have for a year. It's gone from 2 minutes to 6 minutes, and I'm thinking, you're much better now.
It was every 6 seconds the night of the flood.
Yeah.
Every 6 seconds that pump was going.
Right. So that, I mean, so we have these things that we do to kind of tell ourselves everything's okay. And, but if we repeat them over and over again, we drive ourselves nuts. There's got to be some other way, and some way out of these systems that we've created for ourselves. And that is by talking about it, sharing, knowing we're not alone, and hopefully moving forward.
more of a snapshot, 2 snapshots rather than stories. I already submitted my story in writing, so I'm supposed to be talking. But resilience. In Gays Mills, one of my fondest memories of the 2007-2008 floods is being fed from the Red Cross trucks and the disaster trucks, because I love being fed. Whether it's a funeral or whether it's a flood. But this time, we were able to feed ourselves through our community kitchen in Gays Mills, which was built after the 2008 flood. And also, since we had that preparation done, we were able to supply food to other villages around us, so that there were no Red Cross trucks this time. As such, we were feeding ourselves, and did so for at least a couple of weeks after the flood, and liked it so much that we continued monthly community meetings there at our community center and out of our community kitchen well into the summer, and may start them up again. Secondly, a visual image that I have is we live on a hillside next to the bridge, the Kickapoo River Bridge in Gays Mills, on what apparently the fire department rescue squads, as they were taking our neighbors out by boat, dubbed Craig's Island during the flood. But as the roadways were going under at dawn and the bridge, because we had a day's notice in Gays Mills to get ready, I noticed that as the bridge started going under and the roadway, that the concrete rails and such, this was a new bridge built not that long ago, about 10 years ago and such, became covered with spiders and insects and all the creepy crawlers that we oftentimes don't see. So though no people died in this flood, thank goodness, there was loss of non-two-legged life that I'm certainly aware of, and not to mention multi-legged life and such. But I had that snapshot as we were kind of receding as the water was chasing us there, and the bridge just became alive. It became a life raft, swarming with insect and spider life and such.
Anyone else? We have time for just 1 or 2 more. No? Oh, yes.
I'm Susan Cushing, and my house is high and dry. My road and bridge disappears, but my house is safe, and I don't really worry about that. But in hearing all this talk about anxiety, that's something that's been really interesting to me this last year, is because I have that anxiety too, and it's partly because of my friends and community members who I know have this hanging over their heads where they live the next time the water comes up. But where I live, I'm really thinking a lot about the four-legged and the two-legged and the trees. And behind my house in 2008, part of the hillside gave way and all the trees tipped over, and it just left a big quarry in the hill. And so even though my house might not get wet, I look at the land around me as moving, and I see in the woods and in my pastures and fields what happens after the water goes away. And we need to think too about what happens out there. You know, we don't strip crop anymore, it's just corn. So how much soil is being eroded? How much water is going down that hillside now that used to be in strip cropping and holding it? And how much is going on out in the woods and the fields around us that adds to our burden here, because we're maybe not attending to care of the landscape as much as we used to. And so some of my anxiety comes from that. I see the water coming up, or I hear it raining, and I am anxious about the next flood because the hillside might come down on my house one of these times. But I also think about all the loss of life that we don't think about and how that's affecting our whole ecosystem here, as over and over and over, everything drowns out there. I remember in 1978, going as far up 131 as we could go, and I don't remember if it was Bridge 5 or 7, but we couldn't go any further. And there were piles of snakes on the bridge abutments, on the railing. They had nowhere else to go. They couldn't get up the trees, and we looked at that, and the water was still coming up, and we were heading back out, and we know the snakes were gonna all drown. And you don't have to like snakes, but whatever else out there that we need in that ecosystem that is also having a really hard time. So for me, I just think about, well, think about your yards and your fields, and are there buffer zones or ways that you can make it easier for the life you need out there to support your life? And they have a hard time too in the floods, and it's just something, we can't do much about the field flooding and all the field ice going, but it's something to be aware of, that everybody here is taking a big hit when we have these floods, and to maybe take a little care when we can.
Great reminder, something we don't often think about. Yeah, Claudia.
Well, I'm the librarian in Reedstown too. But as far as animals, my dog, she chews her leg now and she wears a sock because she's so traumatized, and she was getting better. And then a couple, maybe a month or more ago, it started raining again, and she's chewing her leg again, and now she's hopping around on it again. So animals do really get affected by it.
Thank you. Anyone else wants to share?
After the flood happened, I really, I think we were all pretty shocked at what happened with the dams. A lot of people looked at that and said, well, if those dams hadn't bust, this flood wouldn't have been so bad. And, those dams let loose with a lot of water all at once, but they let loose the water that we had received, that our soils had not captured and held on those hillsides. They let loose an amount of water that those dams were never really designed to deal with, especially when a lot of the conservation land use that was an integral part of those dams being able to fulfill their function has shifted in recent years. And when you look at the watershed, I always think about watersheds, but Vernon and Monroe are really the headwaters of our watersheds. That's why those dams were built up there, because in those tributaries, you can deal with it. Essentially, in history, the Soil Conservation Service, which became NRCS, was given jurisdiction over the tributaries, and the Army Corps of Engineers had the main stems of the river. That's why the Corps was involved with this project up here, but the SCS was doing, the work in those tributaries. And so what we have is a situation, and after the flood, I live and work in the Gays Mills area, and I heard a lot of people, expressing resentment toward, the counties to the north and, all those dams and this and that and the other thing. But the truth of the matter is, boy, the amount of infrastructure that's tied up in those dams compared to the size of just one county is totally out of whack and out of proportion. I've told all of our politicians this. I don't see how one county can be like Vernon, which has 22 dams, which is 25% of the dams like that, those PL 566 dams in the whole state of Wisconsin. So, that infrastructure that was up there helped for a lot of years. It doesn't seem to be equal to the task anymore with the new rainfall, the new normal, as people call it. But everywhere where we have this highly erodible land and this landscape, we all have, right where we are, an opportunity to stop the rain where it falls. So it's all incremental. You know, the water that we got in Gays Mills didn't all fall up in Vernon and Monroe County and come washing down the river. It also fell in Crawford County. And we also didn't hold it in our fields in Crawford County. So it's going to take an effort, you know, of the entire community to figure this out. But what I think we need to do is we need to do it together because we're a watershed.
Thank you.
Thank you. For sharing your stories, thank you for coming out tonight, and thanks especially to our presenters, Caroline Bushby, Tim Hunt, Brad Steinmetz, and everybody at the Driftless Writing Center wishes you well, and I hope you stay safe